So, having learned most of what I have learned through the community and online resources and just experimenting when it comes to Python and working with data, I often try to apply other areas that interest me or catch my attention to what I'm learning. And one of the things that I thought about as I ran into this problem was Indiana Jones's classic line where Harrison Ford exclaims, "That belongs in a museum." Now, I want to think about that line and where data, quote unquote, belongs, but I also want to think about the line that came before it. Indiana Jones has just tried to steal this relic again and has been pretty successful up until this point. But now he's on a ship in the middle of the ocean in a thunderstorm, and the bad guys have him clutched arm in arm. And Panama Hat, played by Paul Maxwell, comes up to him. He says, "This is the second time I've had to retrieve my property from you." Now, I'm not here to make any claims as to who owned the relic or whether the relic could even be owned, but I wanted to think about that from the perspective of, do you notice the code smell when you have to go retrieve your property again and again? Now, originally, this data set that I had collected and grabbed from Twitter and websites over the course of several months was in JSON. It was in JSON for a few reasons. One, the platform that I was using wanted it to be in a NoSQL Datastore. And two, I was dealing with a lot of JavaScript at the time, so JSON made sense. That said, I noticed time and time again as I was building different pages and different functionality and features that I had to keep calling the same queries again and again, sometimes two or three times on the exact same page, just to load that data in a way that made sense for me. So the first time that I tried this, I used something called SQL Alchemy. SQL Alchemy is an object relational mapper, or ORM. That's what I'm going to call it for the rest of this talk. And the way that it works is it allows you to take data that either exists or should exist in a database. Again, that belongs in a database, or that belongs in a table. And it creates a class-like structure for it. In fact, they are classes. They're Python classes. You're creating objects that represent these pieces of data that exist in your database or will exist in your database, as what we're going to do here. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to create your base. Now, with this, your base is just going to be an object. It's a class object that indicates that this is a thing. In my instance, I have bases for organizations, I have bases for locations, I have bases for different focuses. So my rule of thumb in creating these bases were, if I believed that this was the key item that I wanted to pull, or if it was a piece of data that I wanted to be linked to multiple other objects, then it needed to have its own base. Now, I mentioned having a relationship to other objects. For simple relationships, one-to-one or one-to-many, you're going to have something called a foreign key, where you just reference the foreign key of that object in that other table. But you do have these things called many-to-many relationships, which are these pieces of data, in my case, a diversity focus and a technology focus, where more than one object can be related to one or more pieces of that data. And it's one of the harder concepts to wrap your head around when you're working with databases to begin with. In my case, an organization can have multiple technology or diversity focuses. So I had to create what's called an association table that handles those different relationships. Now, once you have your objects and once you have your association tables with those objects in SQL Alchemy, then you start wanting to build out those objects. So we've created the definitions of what these data points need to be, but we haven't actually worked with the data yet. And this is what we're doing now. We're going to iterate through that JSON data that we have. And for each organization or each object, we're going to assign the mappings of each of those points. We're going to say, hey, name here is equal to this name value, and etc. down the line for all of these items. Here's where things become new. When you're working with data that you're expecting to exist already inside of your database that may not exist yet, you can't just say reference this object because that object may not be there. So what you have to do is instead create what's a really simple pattern called get or create. And this basically says, look for this record. If you don't find it, create it. And then, as I said, you just iterate through each row of data inside of your JSON data. You map those individual items. You do a get or create for all the things that are relational, anything that has a base assigned to it. So technology focuses, diversity focuses, you build those things out. And then also, if in my case you have objects that point to each other, you do the same thing and call the foreign key of those objects. Now, SQL Alchemy is great because it's platform agnostic. As long as you're using Python, you can take data from anywhere and create a database for it. So originally when I did this, I was using SQLite, but I could have applied this to something like MySQL or PostgreSQL or other patterns as long as they were a traditional data store. However, then I would have the challenge of connecting that data to my web framework. Now, I'm not going to say that this is the hardest thing to do, but it is another step in the process. So instead of reaching for SQL Alchemy to solve this problem, ultimately, I wound up going with a web framework that had a built-in ORM. And I did this because at the end of the day, the data would live inside of my database nonetheless. Just because I use the ORM for this web framework doesn't mean that I can't then take that same database and use it somewhere else. And that web framework was Django. Django has a built-in ORM that allows you to not only reference items or create them, but you can tap into that and make your data and let Django do the work for you. That way you know the code that you're writing, you're probably only going to have to write one time. So instead of creating my SQL Alchemy ORM models or bases and then creating Django models, I could just create the Django models because a lot of that code looked very similar. So that's what I did. I just repeated the process that I did for SQL Alchemy, but instead of in SQL Alchemy, I just used Django. I created my models for organizations and technology focuses and diversity focuses. And then I started iterating through my data set. Now, one big difference here was how Django handles many-to-many fields. It actually does a lot of the work for you. It will create those association tables so that you don't have to create them. However, because Django often relies on fetching the ID of an item, you still do that get or create pattern, but you may have to save your data in process of working with it. When you're working with many-to-many fields in Django, instead of iterating through and just adding to the object, you're going to iterate through and you're going to get or create each of those objects, which Django actually has a get or create function built in. Didn't use it, didn't know about it. Now I know, would have used it, will use it in the future. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. And if you are someone that is working with existing data and trying to convert it, I hope that this has been helpful to kind of give you a good starting point. I also hope that if you're a content creator, that you start to think about how you're creating your content. Is it friendly for people who already have existing data and need to move it into a new system or setup that fits what you're talking about? Or are you forcing those people to get rid of their existing data and start over? Final words, if you find yourself saying that Paul Maxwell quote in your head, this is the second time I've had to fetch my property from you, then I hope that it will give you the smell to maybe figure out a better way of doing it.